Most people think Family Guy just goes for shock value and moves on. A joke lands, people get mad online, and by next week, nobody remembers it. Fox executives who sat on these 10 episodes for years would tell you something very different. In this video, we break down every controversial Family Guy episode. Partial terms of endearment. Family Guy has spent more than 2 decades poking at nearly every subject a network comedy is supposed to leave alone. Religion, disability, race, addiction, war, all of it has shown up in some form on the show, usually wrapped in a joke and gone within 30 seconds. Only one episode in the entire run has never been allowed to air on Fox in the United States. That episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment, and the story behind why it got buried says almost as much about the television business as it does about the show itself. By the time this episode was produced, Family Guy was deep into its 8th season, and had already survived cancellation twice. The show had built its reputation on cutaway jokes, absurd tangents, and a willingness to say things other cartoons wouldn't touch. Seth MacFarlane and his writing staff had tackled dark comedy before. Storylines involving death, addiction, and mental illness had all made it to air without much trouble. The show had also built a habit of using its characters as stand-ins for larger arguments happening in American culture, letting Peter Griffin bumble his way through issues, while Lois usually served as the more grounded, reasonable voice in the room. That dynamic had worked for years. Nothing about the show's history suggested that a single episode would end up permanently shelved. Season 8 had already pushed into some uncomfortable territory. The writers were confident enough in their formula to believe they could handle almost any topic and still land jokes without losing the audience. So when the idea came up to build an episode around one of the most divisive subjects in American politics, abortion, the writers moved forward with it the same way they approached everything else, treating it as material for satire rather than a subject to avoid. The plan was to give the topic the full Family Guy treatment, mixing real emotional stakes with the show's usual chaos, and to let both sides of the debate get mocked along the way. The episode was written by Danny Smith, a longtime member of the show's writing staff, and directed by Joseph Lee, who had worked on numerous episodes throughout the show's run by that point. It carries the production distinction of being the 21st and final episode of the 8th season, and the 147th episode of the series overall, placing it right at the closing point of a full production year, rather than somewhere in the middle of the season, where a controversial episode might have been easier to quietly slot in and move past. The story opens with a setup that has almost nothing to do with the heavier material that follows. Lois attends her 20th year college reunion at Salve Regina College, a real school the show places her as having attended in its version of her backstory. Peter is initially reluctant to go along with her, worried about the possibility of running into men Lois might have dated before they were married, a concern that plays out as a fairly standard sitcom joke about jealousy and old relationships. It is at this reunion that Lois reconnects with an old friend from her college years, a woman the show names Naomi, voiced by guest performer Julia Sweeney, alongside her husband, Dale. This reunion functions as the entry point into the episode's central plot, transforming what begins as a lighthearted callback to Lois's past into the setup for the story that follows. The episode centers on Lois being approached by this old friend from college. This friend and her husband are unable to have children of their own, and they ask Lois if she would be willing to carry a baby for them as a surrogate. Peter is against the idea from the start, uncomfortable with the entire concept of his wife carrying a child that isn't biologically theirs. But Lois pushes forward anyway because she wants to help her friend. She goes through in vitro fertilization, a medical procedure used to help people conceive a child outside of the body before transferring the embryo, and the pregnancy moves forward normally. For a while, the episode plays out like a fairly ordinary sitcom setup, an unusual favor between friends that puts strain on a marriage, but nothing more serious than that. Then the writers pull the plot in a different direction. The friend and her husband, the intended parents of the baby Lois is carrying, are killed in a car accident partway through the pregnancy. Lois is left in an impossible position. She is not the biological mother. The people who were supposed to raise this child are gone, and she now has to decide what happens next. The show frames this decision as the emotional center of the episode, giving Lois an actual internal conflict instead of turning the moment into a quick punchline and moving on. This is unusual for Family Guy, a show generally more interested in speed and shock than in slowing down for genuine drama, and it is part of why so many people who eventually saw the episode came away surprised by how seriously it treated the setup. Peter, who spent the earlier part of the episode uncomfortable with the pregnancy itself, suddenly reverses his position once the question turns to whether Lois should end it. He becomes convinced that ending the pregnancy would be wrong, and this shift happens after he is shown material by protesters outside a clinic who are strongly against abortion. A group group that includes a character voiced by guest performer Wil Wheaton. Peter absorbs their message and starts pushing Lois toward carrying the pregnancy to term, going as far as arguing about the responsibility she has to the unborn child. In one of the more pointed exchanges built into the script, Peter runs through a series of increasingly absurd hypothetical scenarios, trying to convince Lois to change her mind. Arguments that grow more ridiculous the longer he talks, undercutting his own position through the sheer exaggeration of his reasoning, rather than through anything Lois says in response. The show uses Peter here the way it uses him in most of its political material, letting him swing wildly from one extreme position to another, based on whoever spoke to him last, which lets the writers mock the confidence of loud voices on the issue, without picking one side to fully endorse. Lois, for her part, is shown genuinely wrestling with the decision, rather than making it quickly. She hears Peter's new position, she considers the protesters he encountered, and she thinks through what carrying the pregnancy to term versus ending it would actually mean for her life and the child's future. After going back and forth with Peter at home, she ultimately decides to have the abortion. The episode does not shy away from showing this decision as final. It is presented as Lois's choice, made after real deliberation, and the show lets that choice stand without reversing it for a last-minute twist. The episode wraps around this central story with the usual Family Guy structure, cutaway gags, side jokes involving other characters, and moments of absurd comedy dropped into an otherwise serious plot. One of the more direct examples of this mixture comes through a musical number performed by the character of God, built around the idea of encouraging someone toward getting an abortion, a song ultimately cut from the version that eventually reached audiences, but one that shows just how far the writers were originally willing to push the satire before reeling certain elements back during editing. Critics who eventually saw the finished product, whether through DVD release or through airings outside the United States, generally agreed that the writing itself was handled with more care than a typical episode. The satire went after both the anti-abortion protesters, who are shown using aggressive and manipulative tactics on Peter, and Peter himself, whose flip-flopping makes him look foolish rather than principled. Nobody in the episode comes across as purely right. That balance is part of why the finished script has often been described as one of the more thoughtful pieces of writing the show ever produced, even though it never reached the audience it was made for. Once the episode finally became available to critics through its DVD release, formal reviews started to appear, giving the public its first real sense of how the finished product actually compared to the controversy surrounding it. IGN's Cindy White reviewed the episode and rated it 7 out of 10, praising the show's willingness to take on a subject deemed too risky for network broadcast standards, while also noting that the humor and overall structure closely matched the series' usual style, suggesting to her that some of the surrounding controversy had been somewhat overstated once the actual content was placed next to a typical episode of the show. Francis Rizzo III, reviewing the same episode for DVD Talk, offered a more lukewarm assessment, describing it as fairly unexceptional when measured directly against other entries in the series, with most of the satire aimed squarely at anti-abortion activism through Peter's exaggerated reactions to the protesters he encounters. These reviews, arriving months after the episode had already become known primarily for being banned, rather than for anything specific inside it, gave audiences a rare chance to judge the writing on its own merits, separate from the surrounding controversy. Production on Partial Terms of Endearment finished in early 2010, placing it as the 21st episode of the 8th season. Around this time, Fox executives began raising concerns about the subject matter, well before the episode was ever scheduled to air. The concerns were not about the quality of the writing. Multiple people involved in the decision later acknowledged that the script handled its subject with more nuance than expected. The concern was about the topic itself, and how showing an episode built around a completed abortion, with a named lead character going through with it, would land with viewers, advertisers, and outside groups already primed to react strongly to anything touching the subject. Fox's president at the time, Kevin Riley, addressed the decision directly. He described abortion as an extremely fragile subject at what he called an extremely fragile economic time, pointing to how sensitive the topic had become across the country at that moment. He explained that out of everything the network could air, this particular issue felt like the one most likely to cause real trouble, both in public backlash and in financial fallout, with advertisers who might pull support from the show or the network. He also made a point of separating the decision from any judgment about the writing itself, noting that the episode had been handled well from a creative standpoint. The ban, in other words, was framed as a business decision rather than a moral one, a distinction Riley seemed to want on the record. That framing matters because it set this episode apart from other Family Guy controversies. Most of the show's controversial episodes aired anyway, drew complaints, and became part of ongoing arguments about what the show should or shouldn't be allowed to joke about. This one never got that chance in its home country. country. Fox pulled it from the broadcast schedule entirely in 2010 and has never aired it since. It was not censored or edited down for content the way some controversial material sometimes is. It was removed completely, treated as if it did not belong on the network at all. The episode did not disappear everywhere. It aired on BBC Three in the United Kingdom on June 20th, 2010, and it later showed up on ITV2 in Britain as well, meaning international audiences had access to the episode months before, and in some cases, instead of American viewers. In the United States, the only way to see it was through a DVD release, which came out on September 28th, 2010, bundled with additional bonus material. That release meant curious fans in America could still track the episode down and judge it for themselves, just not through the network that produced it. The episode also holds a small technical distinction tied to its production history. It was the last Family Guy episode presented in the older, narrower screen format before the show moved permanently to widescreen, and it was also the final episode to use the version of the opening title sequence that had been in place since the show's second season, making it something of a visual bookend, as well as a content one, closing out several different chapters of the show's history, all inside the same 22 minutes. Over time, the episode's total absence from American television became almost as notable as its subject matter. Streaming complicated the picture further. As the show's back catalog moved onto different platforms over the years, Partial Terms of Endearment stayed out of reach, missing from services that otherwise hosted uncut, uncensored versions of nearly every other Family Guy episode ever made. Fans building complete collections of the show would run into this one gap, no matter which platform they searched. A reminder that the earlier decision from 2010 was never revisited or reversed. Even fan communities that catalog every single episode across the show's more than 20 seasons treat this one differently, by necessity, since watching it requires tracking down the DVD release or an international broadcast recording, rather than simply pulling it up through a normal streaming subscription, the way almost every other episode can be found. The comparison point that keeps coming up whenever this episode gets discussed is how television has handled abortion since. Other animated and live-action shows have taken on the same subject in the years that followed, some with far more graphic detail than Family Guy ever attempted, and generally without facing anything close to the same reaction. Shows have walked characters through the actual medical procedure step by step, something Partial Terms of Endearment never came close to depicting. Looking at how loosely later shows were able to handle the same topic raises a real question about whether Fox's decision in 2010 was less about the content of this specific episode and more about the climate around the subject at that specific moment, a climate that clearly shifted in the years afterward. Family Guy's own later material connects to this in a smaller way too. The character Ted, from a separate McFarlane project, eventually got his own storyline dealing with an accidental pregnancy and a character's firm decision to have an abortion, handled with a level of directness that arguably went further than anything in Partial Terms of Endearment. That later material did not generate anywhere near the same level of institutional pushback. No network ban, no over a decade of total absence from broadcast. The contrast has led some who eventually watched the original banned episode to conclude that the ban was, in hindsight, an overly cautious call from a network worried about a moment in American politics, rather than a fair judgment on the episode's actual content. What makes this episode stand out within the larger story of Family Guy's controversies is the type of controversy it represents. Most of the entries on any list of the show's most talked about episodes involve jokes that aired, upset people, and then became part of a public argument that played out after the fact. This episode never got that argument in its home country. There was no wave of viewer complaints following a broadcast, no public statements from advocacy groups reacting to jokes they had actually seen air. Instead, the controversy came from a network deciding, before broadcast, that American audiences should not be given the chance to react to it at all. That distinction, a controversy built entirely around suppression rather than reaction, makes this episode unlike almost anything else the show has produced across more than 20 seasons on the air. It also raises a broader point about where a network draws its line. Family Guy had already run storylines involving death, abuse, addiction, and plenty of other heavy subjects without facing a total broadcast ban. Something about this particular topic landing at this particular political moment crossed a threshold that none of those other episodes had crossed. Riley's comments about economic fragility suggest the decision may have had less to do with the episode's content and more to do with the environment surrounding the subject in 2010, a detail that becomes more interesting once compared with how loosely the same subject gets treated by television now. The gap between how critics eventually judged the finished episode and how nervous the network was before anyone outside the production had seen it is worth sitting with on its own. A rating of 7 out of 10 from a major review outlet, alongside alongside a competing review describing the episode as simply unexceptional next to the show's usual output, does not read like a description of material dangerous enough to justify a total decade-spanning broadcast ban. Both assessments suggest an episode that functions largely the way any other Family Guy episode does, mixing sharp moments with weaker ones, rather than an outlier so extreme it demanded a response unlike anything else in the show's history. That mismatch between the caution shown before broadcast and the fairly ordinary reviews that followed once people were finally able to watch it sits at the center of why this episode continues to come up whenever people discuss the show's most controversial material, even though nothing in it ever actually aired to an American audience in the way its reputation might suggest. None of this answers a question that sits underneath the entire episode, which is why a show that had already gotten away with nearly everything else finally hit a wall on this one specific topic, and what that says about the limits placed on entertainment, even when the writing itself was judged to be handled well. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That question about limits carries directly into a completely different kind of controversy, one that had nothing to do with abortion and instead pulled an entire religious group into the crossfire of a musical number that Fox executives were nervous about for a very different reason. Section 2. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. Family Guy has never been shy about religion. Christianity has taken plenty of hits over the years, and so has organized faith in general, treated the same way the show treats most subjects, as material for a joke rather than something to protect. Judaism is a smaller target in the show's history, but one episode built almost its entire plot around Jewish stereotypes, and the reaction to it stretched out over years rather than days. That episode is called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and its story involves a musical number, a delayed broadcast, and eventually a lawsuit that took nearly a decade to resolve. The episode was originally produced during the show's second season, back when Family Guy was still a fairly new program trying to find its footing on Fox. At that point, the show had already built a reputation for pushing past what other primetime cartoons were willing to do, but it had not yet developed the massive following it would eventually have once reruns on Adult Swim turned it into a hit all over again after its first cancellation. This episode was meant to air as part of that early run, built around the kind of religious material the writers had already shown they were willing to touch. The plan was to close out the season with a story centered on Chris, one that would push Peter into contact with the Griffins' Jewish neighbors in a way the show had not really done before. Despite being produced as part of the second season's production run, the episode did not end up officially counted among the second season's broadcast episodes at all. Because of the years-long delay that followed, it eventually got slotted into the official episode order as the 22nd episode of the third season, and it holds the distinction of standing as the original series finale, airing right before the show's first cancellation took it off the air entirely. That production history means an episode built and written for one specific point in the show's development ended up airing, when it finally did air, at a completely different moment in the series' timeline, closing out a season it was never originally meant to belong to. The episode was written by Ricky Blitt, a member of the show's writing staff, and directed by Dan Povenmire, who worked on the series during this early stretch of its run, before later becoming well known for creating his own animated series. Blitt's involvement as the episode's writer later became a specific point Seth MacFarlane raised while defending the material against accusations of prejudice, since Blitt himself is Jewish, a detail MacFarlane used directly to argue that the writer's room bringing this story to the screen understood the material from the inside rather than mocking it from a distance. The plot follows Peter as he becomes convinced that his son Chris needs help getting smarter, and the solution he lands on is finding a Jewish accountant to fix his family's problems. The idea grows out of a conversation Peter overhears between Quagmire and Cleveland, who talk about how men with Jewish-sounding names had helped them succeed financially. Peter takes this completely out of context and decides that what he needs is a Jewish person in his life to solve his money troubles and help Chris with schoolwork, treating the idea less like a coincidence and more like a guaranteed formula. The show plays this as classic Peter logic, jumping to a conclusion built on almost nothing and running with it as if it were obvious common sense. From there, Peter goes searching for what he believes he needs, and the show turns this search into one of its bigger musical sequences. Peter sings a song that borrows the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star, the well-known song most associated with Disney, but changes the lyrics into something built entirely around wanting a Jewish person to manage his finances and help teach his son. The song leans hard into old stereotypes about Jewish people and money, treating the connection as something so obvious it barely needs explaining within the world of the show. It is one of the more elaborate parody numbers Family Guy had done up to that point, complete with its own staging and choreography cinematography built to mirror the original Disney song shot for shot in places, including a moment where Peter looks out of a window up toward the night sky in a manner that both the show's creators and later opposing lawyers in court agreed was deliberately built to resemble a nearly identical scene from the original Disney film the song came from. Peter's search eventually leads him to Max Weinstein, a Jewish man who happens to be having car trouble right outside the Griffin house. Peter treats this chance encounter as a sign that his wish has been answered, exactly the way a character in an actual Disney story might treat a stroke of luck as fate stepping in. Max ends up helping Peter with his finances the way Peter hoped, and he also helps tutor Chris, giving Peter exactly what he had been chasing after through the song. Peter's enthusiasm for what Max has done for his family eventually pushes the story even further, leading him to the idea of converting Chris to Judaism entirely, believing that adopting the religion itself might guarantee the same kind of success he associates with Max. Lois pushes back against this idea directly within the episode, arguing that success in life has nothing to do with which religion a person happens to practice, giving her one of the more grounded moments in an episode otherwise built almost entirely around Peter's exaggerated logic. The show frames the overall outcome as almost too perfect, a wish granted with fairy tale timing, which is part of what gives the parody its punch as pure comedy, separate from anything it might be saying about Jewish people in general. The line that has stuck with the episode more than almost any other moment comes after Max helps Peter and Chris. Peter, overwhelmed by how well things are going, blurts out an exclamation, asking whether there is anything Jewish people cannot do, treating Max's help as proof of some kind of universal skill rather than one man's individual talent. It is meant as a joke about Peter's tendency to take a stereotype and turn it into a sweeping, over-the-top statement. But out of context, the line reads very differently, and that gap between what the writers intended and how the line could be read cold became a central part of the controversy that followed the episode for years. Fox executives saw an early cut of the episode before its planned broadcast in December of the year 2000, and grew concerned almost immediately. The worry centered on how the material could be read by audiences who did not have the same context the writers did while putting the script together. An episode built around a character wishing for a Jewish person to solve his problems, set to a song about wanting one specific kind of person for a specific kind of benefit, carried real risk of being seen as reinforcing old and harmful ideas about Jewish people and money, rather than mocking those ideas from a safe distance. Fox made the decision to pull the episode from its scheduled slot, rather than risk that reaction landing on the network during a normal broadcast week. This decision came at a rough moment for the show more broadly. Family Guy was already on shaky ground with the network at this point in its run, and the show would end up canceled not long after, with the shelved episode sitting unaired, while the series itself briefly disappeared from the schedule entirely. For a while, it looked like the episode might never see daylight at all, caught in the middle of a show that had lost its slot and a piece of content the network was not comfortable airing under any circumstances. It took a full 3 years before the episode finally got any kind of broadcast, and even then it did not debut on Fox at all. The episode's first public airing came in November of 2003, and it happened on Adult Swim rather than on the network that actually produced it. By this point, Family Guy had built an entirely new audience through reruns airing in that same late-night block, an audience largely made up of viewers discovering the show for the first time outside of its original primetime run. Adult Swim running the episode gave it a home when Fox still would not touch it directly, and the reaction from that audience helped keep interest in the episode alive, even though it had technically been sitting finished and unseen for years by that point. Court records from the later legal dispute over the episode noted that Cartoon Network alone aired the episode no fewer than 36 separate times following its original broadcast, giving a sense of just how much repeat demand the network found for a piece of content Fox itself had refused to touch for years. Fox itself did not air the episode until December of 2004, a full 4 years after it was originally supposed to run. By the time it finally reached the network's own air, Family Guy had already been brought back from cancellation on the strength of strong DVD sales and the audience built through Adult Swim reruns, meaning the show returned to Fox with an entirely different level of leverage than it had when the episode was first shelved. Seth MacFarlane later referenced the episode's history directly during an Adult Swim airing, introducing it by pointing out plainly that this was the episode Fox had refused to air because they considered it too risky, turning the show's own history of censorship into a piece of the joke rather than something to quietly ignore. The controversy did not end once the episode finally aired. Criticism of the material continued well after broadcast, with some viewers and commentators describing the episode episode as leaning into serious stereotyping of Jewish people, rather than simply joking around the edges of the subject. Writers covering the debate pointed specifically to how directly the episode tied Jewish identity to financial skill, treating the connection as an unquestioned punchline, rather than something the show was clearly mocking from a distance.
Lisa Keyes, writing about the episode for The Forward, a publication covering Jewish news and culture, offered a more measured take on the material, concluding that the episode was not necessarily demeaning toward Jewish people, but was simply too weak on its own comedic merits to really land as funny. A review that separated the question of whether the material was offensive from the entirely separate question of whether it actually worked as comedy in the first place. Others pushed back on the harsher reading of the episode entirely, arguing that Family Guy's entire approach across every subject it covers involves grabbing a stereotype and running it into the ground on purpose, using the extremity of the joke itself as the actual target of the humor rather than the group being stereotyped.
MacFarlane himself leaned on a related defense when discussing the backlash, pointing out that a large share of the show's writing staff, roughly 70% by his own accounting, was Jewish at the time, including Ricky Blitt, the specific writer credited with this episode. He also pointed to the casting itself as part of that same defense, noting that Ben Stein, an actor who is Jewish, voiced the rabbi character featured in the episode. The show's own sense of irony extended even further into its casting, since Seth Green, the actor who voices Chris, the character Peter tries to convert to Judaism by the episode's end, is Jewish in real life as well, a detail fans and critics alike have pointed to as an odd little wrinkle sitting underneath the entire storyline. That argument over whether the show was mocking prejudice or simply repeating it with a straight face is one that has followed Family Guy across nearly every controversial episode it has ever produced, and this one became one of the clearest examples people pointed to when making the case either way. Defenders of the show noted that Family Guy treats every group the same way, piling absurd stereotypes onto black characters, Asian characters, disabled characters, and plenty of others, without singling any one group out for special treatment, which they argued should count as a kind of even-handed treatment, even when individual jokes land badly. Critics countered that treating every group with the same blunt disregard does not automatically make any specific joke less harmful, especially one built as directly around a real-world stereotype as this one was. The episode picked up an entirely separate legal problem years after it first aired, one that had nothing to do with how audiences felt about the content, and everything to do with the song itself. On October 3rd, 2007, the Bourne Company, the publishing house that owns the rights to When You Wish Upon a Star, filed a lawsuit against several divisions of Fox, along with Cartoon Network, Fuzzy Door Productions, Seth MacFarlane personally, and Walter Murphy, the composer credited with writing much of the parody song. The lawsuit argued that Peter's musical number, which the show had titled I Need a Jew, was not simply inspired by the original song, but was instead built closely enough on its structure and melody to count as copyright infringement rather than protected parody, and it sought unspecified financial damages, along with an order attempting to halt further distribution of the episode altogether. Court records from the case laid out exactly how the song came together during production. According to filings, MacFarlane and co-producer David Zuckerman first sought a license from Bourne to use the original song directly, a request Bourne turned down. Once permission was refused, the production team asked Walter Murphy to compose new music meant to evoke the original song closely enough to be recognizable, working from lyrics that had already been written for the scene. After Murphy produced an initial version, either MacFarlane or Zuckerman reportedly asked him to bring the melody even closer to the original Disney tune, adjusting several notes specifically so that an average viewer would immediately recognize exactly which song was being parodied. Bourne's lawsuit treated these production details as evidence that the show had deliberately built its parody close enough to the original to cross the line into copyright infringement, rather than protected commentary. Fox and the production company behind the show did not settle quietly, and the case dragged on for roughly a year and a half before finally being resolved. On March 17, 2009, United States District Judge Deborah Batts issued a ruling firmly in Family Guy's favor. Batts found that the lyrics and overall tone of I Need a Jew were, in her own assessment, strikingly different from those of When You Wish Upon a Star, and she ruled that the amount of the original song actually used by the show's writers was no more than necessary to make the target of the parody clearly recognizable to an average listener, a standard central to how courts evaluate whether a parody qualifies for fair use protection. Batts also directly addressed Bourne's argument that the parody damaged the original song's reputation by association with offensive material, finding instead that the wholesome, beloved status Bourne's song had built up over decades, largely through its its long connection to Disney, was precisely what made it a fair target for this kind of ridicule in the first place, since a song carrying that much innocent, magical association becomes exactly the kind of material parody artists are legally permitted to take aim at. The legal fight added a strange second layer to an episode that had already spent years tied up in controversy before it even reached air. Most of Family Guy's controversial episodes generate one wave of reaction and then fade into the background of a much longer list of complaints against the show. This one generated controversy over its content before it aired, controversy over its content again once it finally did air, and then a completely separate legal battle years later that had nothing to do with the Jewish stereotyping angle at all, and everything to do with a music publisher protecting ownership of a 70-year-old Disney song. 3 distinct rounds of conflict, spread out across nearly a decade, all tied back to one 22-minute episode. Once the ruling came down in Fox's favor, the episode settled into a fairly ordinary place within the show's broader catalog, returning to regular syndicated airings across networks including Adult Swim and TBS without any further restriction. Looking at the episode now, decades removed from its original production, it sits in an unusual spot within the larger history of the show. It was not the first Family Guy episode to get held back by network concerns, and it would not be the last controversial thing the show ever produced, but the specific combination found here, a religious stereotype serious enough to delay broadcast by years, paired with a legal fight over the exact song used to deliver that stereotype, has not repeated itself anywhere else in the show's run. Most controversial episodes involve one clear problem. This one involved 2 entirely separate problems that happened to live inside the same 22 minutes of television. The debate over whether the episode crossed a real line or simply played the show's usual game a little too close to a sensitive subject has never fully settled either way, and that lack of resolution is part of what keeps the episode coming up whenever people talk about the most divisive things Family Guy has ever put on screen. Unlike some of the show's other controversial material, there was no dramatic apology, no formal retraction, and no lasting damage to the show's relationship with Fox once the DVD sales and Adult Swim ratings made clear that audiences wanted more of this exact kind of material, regardless of how uncomfortable individual episodes made people. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern, an episode built around real-world sensitivity that ends up sparking arguments over whether the show is punching at prejudice or simply repeating it, shows up again in a very different kind of story, one that trades religious stereotypes for something far more personal and far harder to laugh off, involving a character dealing with abuse from the person she loves most. Section 3. Screams of Silence. The story of Brenda Q. Family Guy has built an entire identity around never treating anything as too serious to joke about. Death, addiction, war, and religion have all been fair game for a quick punchline before the show moves on to the next gag. One episode from the show's 10th season broke that pattern almost entirely. It took a subject most comedies avoid handling directly at all, and instead of playing it for laughs, the way the show usually does, it built an entire half hour around it, with a tone the series had never really used before. That episode is called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, and it remains one of the most argued over entries in the show's history, not because of a single joke that went too far, but because of a choice to barely joke at all. The episode aired on Fox on October 30th, 2011, as the 3rd episode of the show's 10th season, making it the 168th episode overall. It was written by Alex Sulkin, one of the show's longtime writers, and directed by Dominic Bianchi, who had worked on the series for years by that point. Sulkin and Bianchi were both deeply familiar with the show's usual rhythm, rapid cutaway jokes, absurd tangents, and characters bouncing back from horrifying situations without any real consequences. This episode asked them to do something almost opposite to that formula, building a story where the horror stayed in place, instead of getting brushed off for the next gag. The setup begins with Quagmire, the Griffin's neighbor known throughout the show for his exaggerated and often disturbing sexual behavior. Quagmire is found by Peter and Joe after a fishing trip, unconscious and in serious medical trouble, following an attempt at a dangerous act tied to self-pleasure that went wrong and nearly killed him. He ends up hospitalized because of it, which sets the stage for the rest of the episode by pulling his family into the story. While Quagmire is recovering, his sister Brenda, voiced by guest performer Caitlin Olsen, arrives to look after him, along with her boyfriend Jeff, voiced by Ralph Garman, a character the show had briefly introduced in an earlier season under a similar setup with a different name attached to the same idea. This episode expanded that earlier concept into something the writers clearly intended as a full story story, rather than a passing joke. Brenda is shown as deeply devoted to her brother, singing him a song from their childhood to help pull him out of unconsciousness, a small detail meant to establish her as caring and gentle before the darker parts of her story take over. Jeff, meanwhile, is presented almost immediately as controlling and volatile, complaining about having to be at the hospital and making his frustration obvious to everyone around him. The neighborhood soon becomes aware of just how disruptive Jeff's presence is, with his loud outbursts keeping people up and putting immediate strain on everyone connected to Brenda, including Quagmire himself, who is trying to recover in the middle of all of it. The story shifts into more serious territory once Lois takes Brenda out to a restaurant and tries to talk with her about her relationship with Jeff. During that outing, Lois notices that Brenda is wearing sunglasses indoors, which leads her to realize that Brenda is hiding a black eye given to her by Jeff. This moment marks the point where the episode stops treating Jeff's behavior as background noise and turns it into the direct subject of the plot. From here, the story follows Quagmire, Peter, and Joe as they try to figure out what to do once they understand what is actually happening to Brenda behind closed doors. As the extent of the situation becomes clearer to everyone around her, Joe suggests the group hold a formal intervention, bringing together the Griffins, the Swansons, and Quagmire himself to confront Brenda directly about her relationship. One particularly grim detail included in the episode involves Jeff striking Brenda over something as small as which late-night talk show she chooses to watch, switching the channel away from his preference, a moment the show plays without any comedic softening, using the pettiness of the excuse to underline just how arbitrary Jeff's outbursts really are. The intervention itself does not go as the group hopes. Rather than convincing Brenda to leave, she reveals to the gathered group that she and Jeff are actually engaged and expecting a child together, news that lands as a gut punch to everyone hoping the conversation might change her mind about the relationship. The men initially try talking to Brenda directly, hoping that pointing out what Jeff is doing to her will be enough to convince her to leave him. This does not work. Brenda remains loyal to Jeff throughout the episode, staying by his side even as the evidence of his abuse becomes harder to ignore, and even after the people around her make their concerns clear. The show uses this refusal to leave as a central piece of the story, rather than something resolved quickly, forcing Quagmire and his friends to confront the reality that words alone were not going to change Brenda's situation. Joe, a police officer, becomes an important figure in how the story handles the legal side of the situation. At one point, he tells Quagmire that the police cannot arrest Jeff for hitting Brenda unless Brenda herself files a formal complaint against him, framing the law as something that requires the victim to take an active step before anyone with authority can step in. This detail became one of the more debated factual claims tied to the episode once it aired, since real domestic violence law in the state the show is set in does not actually work the way Joe describes it. Under Rhode Island law, police are required to make an arrest once there is probable cause that a domestic assault has taken place, regardless of whether the victim personally files a complaint. The episode's version of the law, which suggests officers are essentially powerless without Brenda's direct cooperation, does not match how the actual legal process is supposed to work, and this inaccuracy became one of the specific details critics pointed to once discussion of the episode picked up. With legal options apparently closed off inside the world of the story, Quagmire, Peter, and Joe move toward a far more extreme solution. The three of them decide that the only way to protect Brenda is to kill Jeff themselves, treating it as the last remaining option after talking and legal pressure both failed to change anything. Before the group can act on that plan, Jeff himself escalates the situation further, producing a gun and physically assaulting all three men, turning what had been an emotional standoff into a direct, violent confrontation initiated by Jeff rather than by the group planning against him. Joe, despite being a police officer sworn to uphold the law, agrees to go along with the plan once he sees the extent of Jeff's behavior firsthand, choosing to look past his role in law enforcement in favor of what the group frames as protecting Brenda directly. This decision turns the back half of the episode into something closer to a revenge plot than a typical Family Guy storyline, with the show committing fully to following through on the group's decision rather than pulling back or finding a lighter resolution. The confrontation between Quagmire and Jeff becomes physical, with Jeff at one point attempting to choke Quagmire during their fight, escalating the danger of the moment well beyond anything the show typically shows its characters facing from each other. Quagmire ultimately succeeds in killing Jeff, ending the threat Jeff represented to Brenda by resolving it through direct violence rather than any kind of legal or emotional intervention. Brenda, still shown as loyal to Jeff even after his death, is left grieving him rather than relieved, maintaining her attachment to him through the very end of the episode. The story closes without giving her any kind of clear resolution or forward movement beyond that grief, and she never never appears again in the series after this episode, leaving her actual fate and mindset afterward completely unaddressed by the show going forward. Critical reaction to the episode when it first aired was overwhelmingly negative, standing out even among a show accustomed to divided reviews. Kevin McFarland, reviewing the episode for the AV Club, offered a blunt assessment, writing that a serious episode of Family Guy undercuts the very strengths that usually make the show work, arguing that stripping away the show's usual reliance on irony and quick cutaways left the episode with almost nothing else to fall back on once the tone shifted this far into genuine drama. That same review pointed specifically to individual scenes, including the beating triggered by the television remote, as feeling flat and undercooked precisely because the surrounding jokes had been stripped away, leaving only the discomfort of the premise itself, without the show's usual comedic scaffolding holding it up. Other critics, writing after the episode aired, described it in similarly harsh terms, calling it tone-deaf and lacking the sensitivity the subject required, with much of the criticism converging on the idea that an episode with real potential to say something meaningful about abuse instead came across as mean-spirited toward the very people it was ostensibly trying to depict with seriousness. The episode's international broadcast added its own small data point to the story. When it debuted in the United Kingdom on BBC Three, it drew an audience of roughly 1.26 million viewers, giving a clear sense of how much attention the episode pulled in, even outside its original American broadcast, adding to the wider reach of a story that was already generating significant conversation online among longtime fans of the show. Reaction to the episode split sharply once it aired, and that split centered less on any single joke and more on the show's decision to handle domestic violence as directly as it did. Some viewers and critics saw real value in an episode that refused to soften the reality of abuse, arguing that showing Jeff's behavior without turning it into comedy sent a clear message about how serious the situation actually was. Under this reading, the episode worked precisely because it did not try to make Brenda's suffering funny, treating her situation with a weight the show almost never gives to anything. Other viewers, including some who had personally experienced domestic violence, felt the episode still fell short of handling the subject responsibly, even with its more serious tone. Criticism focused on how openly and publicly Jeff behaved throughout the episode, since real domestic abusers typically hide their behavior from outsiders and present a controlled, even likable image to people outside the relationship, only revealing their true behavior in private. Jeff, by contrast, is shown ranting loudly in front of neighbors and behaving erratically in ways an actual abuser would likely work hard to hide, which critics argued gave audiences an inaccurate picture of what abuse in a relationship actually tends to look like from the outside. This gap between the show's version of an abuser and how real abusive relationships typically function became one of the most repeated criticisms of the episode over the years. There was also strong criticism directed at how Brenda's loyalty to Jeff was portrayed, with some viewers feeling the episode leaned towards suggesting that victims simply stay in abusive relationships without giving enough attention to the psychological pressure and fear that usually keeps someone trapped in that situation. Combined with the show's decision to resolve the entire conflict through Quagmire killing Jeff, rather than through any process involving real intervention or support for Brenda herself, some critics argued the episode ultimately delivered a confused message, mixing a serious subject with a solution that had far more in common with the show's usual over-the-top plotting than with anything resembling how these situations get handled in real life. Some later critical reassessments of the episode went even further, holding it up specifically against other animated shows that took on similar subject matter with more consistent care. Comparisons were drawn to series that addressed abuse and trauma as ongoing conditions with lasting consequences stretching across a character's life, treating the subject with a kind of patience and follow-through. This episode never attempted, given that Brenda vanished from the show entirely once this single episode ended, leaving no further exploration of what happened to her afterward. These comparisons reinforced the argument that the episode had genuine potential, given the seriousness of its subject and the talent behind the writing staff, but ultimately fell short of the standard other shows working with far smaller budgets and tighter content restrictions had already managed to meet. The controversy around the episode did not fade quickly, and Fox eventually responded to the criticism in an unusual way. In 2014, 3 years after the episode's original broadcast, a director's cut version aired that removed a significant portion of the original scenes and replaced them with new material. According to detailed accounts of the changes, the revised version added scenes establishing that the people around Brenda understood from a much earlier point that Jeff was abusive, adjusting the pacing of how the group comes to recognize the danger rather than leaving that realization to build as slowly as the original cut had. This kind of revision is rare for the show, which typically does not go back and alter episodes episodes once they have aired, making this one of the few times Family Guy directly addressed backlash by changing the finished product, rather than simply letting the original version stand as released. The episode also drew direct comparisons to how other shows had handled similar subject matter, including animated series aimed at younger audiences that some critics felt managed to address the topic of abusive relationships with more care, despite working within tighter content restrictions. These comparisons became part of the larger argument that Family Guy, given the near total creative freedom it had earned by its 10th season, had more room than almost any other show on television to get a difficult subject right, which made the flaws critics identified in its execution stand out even more. What makes this episode different from most of the other entries on any list of Family Guy's most controversial material is where the controversy actually comes from. Most of the show's controversial episodes get criticized for a joke that goes too far, a punchline aimed at a group of people, or a moment that crosses a line the show usually respects.
This episode drew criticism for the opposite reason, for trying to remove the jokes almost entirely and getting called out instead for how accurately, or inaccurately, it portrayed a real and serious issue once the comedy was stripped away. It is one of the only times critics evaluated a Family Guy episode less like a comedy and more like a drama attempting to say something true about a difficult subject, holding it to a completely different standard than the show usually gets judged by. Even years removed from its original broadcast, the episode continues to surface in retrospective discussions of the show's history, generally cited less as an example of Family Guy going too far with a joke, and more as a cautionary example of what happens when a comedy built entirely around irony and distance tries to abandon both at once. The mixed handful of individual moments still praised within the episode, including parts of Caitlin Olsen's performance as Brenda and the intensity of the final confrontation between Quagmire and Jeff, have done little to change the broader consensus that the episode remains one of the more uncomfortable entries in the show's back catalog, sitting there as a reminder that stepping outside the show's usual comedic formula carries its own set of risks, entirely separate from the risks tied to any individual joke. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That shift in how the episode gets evaluated, less about whether a joke was funny and more about whether the underlying message held up, connects directly to another entry on this list involving a crossover between two of the biggest animated shows in television history, where a single joke about a serious topic managed to spark almost the exact same kind of debate in a completely different context. Section 4. The Simpsons Guy, a crossover joke that sparked real complaints. Family Guy had spent more than a decade taking constant jabs at The Simpsons, treating it as the show it was most often compared to, and occasionally poking fun at that comparison directly inside its own episodes. For years, fans wondered whether the two shows would ever actually share the screen together. That question was finally answered in September of 2014, when Fox aired an hour-long crossover bringing the Griffins and The Simpsons into the same story for the first time. The episode became one of the most watched events of the season, but it is remembered today almost as much for one specific joke as it is for the crossover itself. The episode was called The Simpsons Guy, and it served as the premiere of Family Guy's 13th season. The idea for a crossover had been floated for years by fans and by people involved with both shows, but it took until 2013 for Fox to actually greenlight the project during early planning for the new season. Once the idea moved forward, both writing staffs worked to build a story that would let the two families meet in a way that made sense within each show's own history, while still giving fans of both series plenty of the humor they expected from each side. The plot sets up the meeting by having the Griffin family lose their home in Quahog after Peter writes and publishes a comic strip that upsets nearly everyone in town with how it treats women. Forced to leave, the Griffins hit the road looking for a new place to live, and their car gets stolen along the way, stranding them in an unfamiliar town. That town turns out to be Springfield, the fictional home of the Simpson family, and the crossover kicks into gear once the two families cross paths and slowly get pulled into each other's lives. The episode leans into fish-out-of-water comedy for a good portion of its runtime, letting Peter, Lois, and their kids react to Springfield's residents while the Simpsons deal with having the notoriously chaotic Griffin family suddenly living among them. Much of the episode plays out as a fairly straightforward combination of both shows' usual styles, mixing Simpsons-style small-town satire with Family Guy's faster, more chaotic sense of humor. Fans got extended interactions between characters from both shows, including moments pairing up characters who had never shared a scene before, and the episode spent real time letting each family's personality bounce off the other's world. For much of its build-up online before airing, discussion of the episode centered on excitement over finally seeing this pairing happen after so many years of anticipation. That excitement shifted
ended once Fox released preview footage from the episode months before it actually aired. The footage included a short scene built around Bart Simpson, one of the most well-known troublemakers in television history, showing off one of his signature prank phone calls to Moe, the bartender who runs Moe's Tavern in Springfield. Bart's version of the prank is presented as harmless and silly, built around a made-up name designed to trick Moe into shouting something embarrassing across his bar for the amusement of his customers. It is the kind of joke Bart has been doing on the show for decades, mild by comparison to almost anything else either series has ever aired. The scene continues with Stewie, the Griffin family's infant, watching Bart make his prank call and deciding he wants to try one of his own. Rather than following Bart's harmless format, Stewie makes his own call to Moe and delivers a line referencing sexual assault against Moe's sister before immediately hanging up. The joke has no real setup and no punchline beyond the line itself, landing as a single blunt statement rather than building toward anything. Bart is shown reacting to Stewie's version with visible disapproval, a small detail some viewers later pointed to as evidence that even the writers understood the joke crossed into territory well beyond the kind of humor Bart himself represents. Once this preview footage became public, reaction moved quickly, and it did not fade before the episode's actual broadcast. The Parents Television Council, an advocacy group that had criticized Family Guy many times over the years for its handling of sensitive material, became one of the most vocal opponents of the joke specifically. Tim Winter, the organization's president at the time, said he sought out the trailer after hearing about it because of his long-standing appreciation for The Simpsons and its creator, Matt Groening, and described being genuinely shocked once he saw the scene for himself. Winter did not limit his response to public statements. He wrote directly to Groening, to Family Guy creator Seth MacFarlane, and to Fox itself during the months leading up to the episode's broadcast, asking that the line be removed before it aired on television. He pointed specifically to the timing of the joke, noting that it was landing during a period when sexual assault on college campuses and cases of abuse involving professional athletes were already receiving heavy national attention. Winter argued that treating sexual assault as a punchline in a major crossover event risked making the subject feel less serious to audiences watching at home, especially given how widely viewed the episode was expected to be. According to Winter, none of the letters he sent received any response from Fox, MacFarlane, or Groening before the episode aired as originally planned. The controversy grew large enough that it pulled in other groups whose focus specifically involves supporting survivors of sexual assault. Catherine Hull Flifflet, a spokesperson for the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, offered a different read on the scene once asked about it directly. She suggested that the way the joke was positioned actually communicated to viewers that the behavior itself was not something to find funny, framing Stewie's line as something the show was using to highlight bad behavior rather than endorse it. Her comment gave the debate a second side beyond simple condemnation, showing that even organizations focused directly on supporting survivors were not unanimous in how they read the intent behind the joke. Seth MacFarlane offered his own limited defense of the material once questions about it reached him directly, describing the joke as something that worked, in his view, once seen within the full context of the scene, rather than judged purely from a short clip circulating before the episode aired. This response did little to calm the criticism building around the episode, and Fox itself largely avoided detailed public comment on the matter in the lead-up to broadcast, choosing not to pull the scene or alter the episode, despite the letters Winter said he had sent. The episode aired as originally planned on September 28, 2014, with the joke intact exactly as it had appeared in the earlier preview footage. Reaction once the full episode reached air split along lines similar to the debate that had already been playing out for weeks beforehand. Some critics and reviewers pointed to the joke as a clear example of everything that had made Family Guy controversial for years, a moment built entirely around shock value, with no real comic structure behind it beyond the harshness of the subject itself. Several reviews specifically criticized the contrast between Bart's style of humor, built on mischief and slapstick, and Stewie's version, built on shock for its own sake, arguing that placing the two side by side only made clear how differently each show approached comedy, and how poorly Family Guy's approach fit into a story otherwise built around The Simpsons and its more grounded style of humor. This was not an isolated incident for the show around this same period either. Just months earlier, in November of 2013, an entirely separate Family Guy episode had already drawn a formal complaint from the Parents Television Council to the Federal Communications Commission over jokes involving similar subject matter, including material referencing child abuse and violence against women. That complaint showed the network was already facing organized pushback over how the show handled these subjects well before The Simpsons crossover ever aired, making The Simpsons Guy less an isolated flashpoint and more another entry in an ongoing pattern of friction between Family Guy and groups monitoring its content. The crossover joke also arrived not long after another widely discussed controversy involving MacFarlane personally, tied to a musical number he performed while hosting the Academy Awards the year before. That performance had already drawn heavy criticism for jokes many viewers considered demeaning toward women, and critics revisiting The Simpsons crossover joke sometimes pointed back to that earlier controversy as part of a larger pattern connecting MacFarlane's sense of humor to material that repeatedly generated complaints about how it treated women and serious subjects involving violence against them. What set this particular controversy apart from many of Family Guy's other run-ins with advocacy groups was the sheer size of the audience watching. Most controversial Family Guy episodes generate debate primarily among longtime fans and critics who already follow the show closely. This episode arrived as a massive crossover event, promoted heavily by Fox for months in advance, drawing in casual Simpsons viewers who may not have followed Family Guy regularly and were seeing this particular brand of humor for the first time inside a story built around a show with an entirely different reputation for its content. That mismatch between audiences may have amplified the reaction beyond what a similar joke might have generated inside a normal episode airing on a normal week. The debate around this single joke also highlighted something that comes up repeatedly across Family Guy's history of controversial material: the gap between how the show's own defenders describe its intent and how outside critics interpret the same material once it reaches a wider audience. MacFarlane's defense rested on the idea that context changes how a joke lands. Winter's criticism rested on the idea that certain subjects carry enough real-world weight that no amount of context fully neutralizes the risk of trivializing them. Neither side fully convinced the other, and the disagreement was never formally resolved beyond the episode simply airing as written and the conversation eventually moving on to other subjects as new controversies took its place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same tension between a joke's intended framing and how directly it lands on a subject many people take very seriously connects into another entry on this list involving a Fox network decision made years earlier, one that pulled an entire episode from broadcast before American audiences ever had the chance to react to it themselves. Section 5, Extra Large Medium, the episode that made Sarah Palin furious. Family Guy has taken on plenty of real people over the years, twisting celebrities and politicians into background jokes or full storylines without much concern for how those people might feel about it. Most of the time, the subject of the joke either laughs it off or ignores it entirely. One episode from the show's 8th season became an exception to that pattern, sparking a public back and forth that pulled in a former vice presidential candidate, her teenage daughter, and the actress who ended up caught in the middle of the entire argument. That episode is called Extra Large Medium, and it remains one of the clearest examples of a Family Guy joke landing directly on a real family, rather than staying safely inside the fictional world of the show. The episode aired on Fox on February 14th, 2010, landing on Valentine's Day, a detail that adds a strange layer of irony to a storyline built around a disastrous first date. It was written by Steve Callahan, who served as one of the show's longtime writers and eventual showrunner, and directed by John Holmquist, a series regular behind the camera. The episode carries two separate storylines running side by side, a structure common throughout the show's history, with one plot following Peter and the other following his son Chris. It was the second plot, involving Chris, that ended up defining the episode's legacy far more than anything involving Peter. The Chris storyline begins after he and his younger brother Stewie get lost in the woods during a family hike, wandering off after chasing a butterfly and ending up missing for several days before eventually being found safe. Once the two boys are back home, Chris follows through on a promise he made while lost, deciding to ask out a classmate from school named Ellen. Ellen has Down syndrome, and the show frames Chris's decision to ask her out as a moment of genuine courage rather than pity, treating his nervousness around the date the same way any awkward teenage romance storyline might be handled on the show. Before the date happens, Stewie steps in to help prepare Chris, dressing him up and coaching him through a musical number meant to build his confidence and get him ready for the evening ahead. This section of the episode plays largely as typical Family Guy comedy, built around Stewie's usual dry, know-it-all attitude, layered over an otherwise sweet setup involving his older brother trying to work up the nerve to go on a date. Nothing in this part of the storyline pointed toward the reaction the episode would eventually receive once it aired in full. The date itself is where the story takes its sharper turn. Ellen initially comes across as friendly and easygoing when Chris first approaches her, but once the actual date begins, her personality shifts into something far more demanding and difficult. She is shown repeatedly slapping Chris, criticizing him harshly, and pushing him into uncomfortable situations throughout the evening, behaving in a way that is pushy, controlling, and at times outright cruel. The show plays this shift as a deliberate subversion, taking a character the audience might expect to be portrayed as gentle or endlessly sympathetic simply because of her disability, and instead giving her a personality just as flawed, difficult, and demanding as any other character on the show.
By the end of the date, the relationship collapses entirely, with Ellen ending things and Chris walking away, having learned that assuming someone would be automatically easy to be around because of a disability was its own kind of unfair assumption. Buried inside this storyline is a single line that ended up overshadowing almost everything else about the episode once it aired. During the date, Ellen mentions offhand that her father works as an accountant and that her mother served as the former governor of Alaska. At the time the episode aired, only one woman had ever held that specific position, Sarah Palin, who had served as governor of Alaska before becoming the Republican nominee for vice president in 2008. The line functions as a direct, unmistakable reference connecting Ellen's fictional family background to Palin's real one, a detail made even sharper by the fact that Palin's own youngest son, Trig, was born with Down syndrome in 2008, roughly 2 years before this episode aired. The reaction from the Palin family came quickly and publicly. Bristol Palin, Sarah Palin's daughter, posted a response on her mother's Facebook page just 2 days after the episode aired, describing the show as a particularly pathetic cartoon and accusing the writers of failing in what she considered their attempt to be clever at her family's expense. Her statement framed the episode as a direct attack aimed at her younger brother Trig, rather than a broader piece of satire, treating the line about the former governor of Alaska as confirmation that the writers had built the joke specifically around her family's situation. Sarah Palin herself addressed the controversy separately, appearing on Fox News and discussing the episode directly with host Bill O'Reilly on his program. She described the episode as feeling like another difficult blow tied to how the public and the media handled her family's experience raising a child with Down syndrome. And she raised broader questions about where entertainment should draw the line when it comes to jokes involving children with disabilities and their families. O'Reilly, for his part, offered a sharp characterization of Seth MacFarlane during the same conversation, aligning himself firmly with Palin's frustration over how the episode had handled the subject. The controversy created an unusual situation given the corporate relationships involved. Both Fox, the network that aired Family Guy, and Fox News, the network where Palin voiced her complaints, were owned by the same media company at the time. That overlap meant one arm of the same company aired the joke while another arm of the same company gave Palin a platform to criticize it just days later, a detail that added a layer of irony some commentators pointed out once the story picked up wider attention. The most notable response to the entire controversy did not come from Palin, from Fox, or from anyone connected to the show's writing staff. It came from Andrea Faye Friedman, the actress who voiced Ellen in the episode, and who herself has Down syndrome. Friedman had built a career appearing in guest roles on other television programs before taking on this part, and once the backlash against the episode grew, she chose to respond directly and publicly, rather than staying quiet while other people argued about a character she had personally brought to life. Friedman sent a statement to multiple media outlets addressing the controversy head-on. She identified herself clearly as a person born with Down syndrome, and explained that she understood the joke about the former governor of Alaska as a reference aimed squarely at Palin herself, not at Palin's son or at people with Down syndrome more broadly. She expressed a wish to see more of her own character going forward, and less of the ongoing argument surrounding Palin's reaction, effectively pushing back against the idea that she had been used or exploited by a joke targeting her own community. Her statement made clear that she saw the humor as something she had knowingly taken part in, rather than something done to her without her understanding or consent. MacFarlane later brought up Friedman's response directly during an appearance discussing the controversy, using her own statement as central evidence that the joke had been misunderstood by critics who assumed the line was mocking people with Down syndrome in general, rather than targeting one specific public figure through a fictional character's dialogue. This distinction between mocking a disability itself and using a fictional character with a disability to deliver a political jab at a real politician became the core argument running through the entire controversy, with each side interpreting the same 11-word line in a completely different way. Critical response to the episode beyond the political controversy was mixed, but generally more focused on the writing itself than on any social commentary. Some reviewers described the plot as uneven in overall quality, while still praising specific moments scattered throughout the episode as some of the strongest material the show had produced in recent memory. Other critics singled out the handling of Ellen's character specifically, describing the choice to give her a difficult, demanding personality instead of a purely sympathetic one as a genuinely fresh approach to writing a character with a disability, treating her as a fully realized person rather than a symbol of inspiration or pity. The episode's writers had built the twist around Ellen's personality specifically to challenge the assumption that a person with Down syndrome must be automatically kind, gentle, or easy simply because of
their diagnosis. Chris directly acknowledges this assumption once the date falls apart, admitting that he had expected Ellen to fit a certain stereotype and instead found himself dealing with a complicated, difficult person, just like anyone else he might have dated. This part of the storyline, largely separate from the political joke about Palin, received some of the more positive attention from critics, who felt it handled the subject of dating someone with a disability in a way that avoided turning Ellen into a simple object of either mockery or sympathy. Despite that more nuanced handling of Ellen's actual personality, the single line referencing her mother as the former governor of Alaska became the detail that defined how most people remembered the episode once the controversy took hold. The broader storyline about Chris confronting his own assumptions largely faded into the background of public discussion, replaced almost entirely by the fight between the Palin family and the show's creative team playing out across Facebook posts and cable news appearances in the days following the broadcast. This pattern, a single specific line overshadowing a more complicated overall episode, is not unique to this particular controversy, but it stands out here because of how directly it tied a fictional joke to a real, identifiable family going through a real situation involving a child with a disability. Unlike jokes aimed at general stereotypes or broad political figures, this line connected directly to a specific child who had no involvement in the show, the joke, or the decision to air it, which is part of why the Palin family's response carried a different tone than the usual celebrity reaction to being mocked on the show. The episode also sits at an interesting point in the larger argument over where satire targeting a public figure crosses into territory that affects people who never chose to be public figures themselves. In this case, a child too young to have any say in how his own medical condition became part of a joke aimed at his mother's political career. Friedman's response complicated that argument further, since she herself, as a person actually living with the condition being referenced, did not read the joke as an attack on people with Down syndrome at all, creating a split even among people most directly connected to the subject over how the line should be understood. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same argument over where a joke aimed at a public figure crosses into territory involving people who never asked to be part of the conversation comes up again in a completely different context, involving an episode built around religion, deception, and a portrayal of a figure far more universally recognized than any single American politician. Section 6. Turban Cowboy, an episode overtaken by real-world events. Family Guy has built entire episodes around religion for years, treating faith the same way it treats almost every other subject, as something to poke, twist, and joke about without much concern for how seriously other people take it. Most of those episodes generate the usual mix of laughs and complaints before fading into the background of the show's long history. One episode from the show's 11th season took a different path entirely, not because of the jokes it told when it first aired, but because of something that happened in the real world exactly 1 month later, an event that changed how the entire episode would be treated for years afterward. That episode is called Turban Cowboy. The episode aired on Fox on March 17, 2013, as the 15th episode of the show's 11th season. It was written by Artie Johan and Sean Reese, and directed by Joe Vox, part of the show's regular rotation of writers and directors by that point in its run. The episode also featured guest voice work from sportscaster Bob Costas and actor Omid Abtahi, who provided the voice for Mahmoud, the character at the center of the episode's central storyline. The plot begins with Peter, Quagmire, and Joe sitting around at the Drunken Clam, the bar they regularly spend time at throughout the series, complaining about how boring their lives have become. Looking for something to shake things up, the three of them decide to take up skydiving together, following through on the idea almost immediately. Peter throws himself into the new hobby with his usual lack of caution, and the show spends the early part of the episode showing him jumping repeatedly, despite Lois expressing growing concern over how often his jumps end in some kind of accident. That pattern eventually catches up with him during a jump in Las Vegas, where an accident lands Peter in the hospital. It is here, recovering from his injuries, that Peter meets Mahmoud, a fellow patient who happens to be Muslim. The two men strike up a genuine friendship during Peter's recovery, and once Peter is discharged, he invites Mahmoud back to the Drunken Clam to meet his usual group of friends. The introduction does not go smoothly. Quagmire and Joe quickly realize they have almost nothing in common with Mahmoud once they learn he does not drink alcohol and does not look at other women the way they typically do, habits that make up a large part of how the group normally spends their time together. Despite that awkward first meeting between Mahmoud and the rest of the group, Peter's personal friendship with him continues to grow. Mahmoud begins introducing Peter to different aspects of Islamic culture and religious practice, and Peter finds himself genuinely drawn to what he is learning, eventually deciding he wants to convert and become Muslim himself. Lois expresses some hesitation once she notices how deeply Peter has started studying the religion, but she ultimately decides not to interfere, choosing to let Peter pursue this new interest the way he has pursued plenty of other short-lived obsessions throughout the show's history. The storyline takes its darker turn once Mahmoud invites Peter to attend a gathering with other members of his community. What Peter believes is a simple religious or social event turns out to be something far more serious, a meeting connected to a group of terrorists planning to blow up the Quahog Bridge, the fictional bridge that appears throughout the show's setting. Peter finds himself pulled into the plot entirely by accident, having no idea what he has actually walked into until the plan is already well underway. When Peter mentions to Quagmire and Joe that he has been trying to act inconspicuous during his time with this new group, the two of them grow suspicious that something is seriously wrong, eventually piecing together that Peter has stumbled into a terrorist plot without realizing it. Once Peter himself understands the situation, he wants no part of it and tries to back out. Joe convinces him to stay involved anyway, arguing that since Peter is already on the inside of the group, he is in a position to help stop the plan from succeeding. Peter agrees to continue on, wearing a hidden microphone so Joe and Quagmire can listen in as the plan develops. The plot moves forward quickly once Peter discovers he has been assigned to drive the van carrying the explosives to the bridge. His cover is blown when the terrorists discover the microphone he is wearing, and once his real role becomes known, the plan gets rushed into motion, with Peter held at gunpoint and forced to drive the explosive-laden van toward the bridge himself. The episode resolves with Peter attempting to talk Mahmoud out of following through with the attack, an effort that fails to change Mahmoud's mind. Joe arrives just in time to physically stop the bombing, managing to knock the detonator out of Mahmoud's hand before the plan can be carried out, bringing the storyline to a close with the bridge and everyone on it saved from the attack. The episode wraps up shortly after, closing out what had started as a fairly ordinary storyline about a new friendship and ended as a full-blown terrorist plot involving explosives and a hostage situation. Reaction to the episode when it first aired followed a pattern familiar to plenty of other Family Guy episodes dealing with religion or culture. Some critics and viewers felt the show leaned on familiar and worn-out stereotypes about Muslim characters, particularly the idea of Muslim men treating women as subordinate, and the broader assumption connecting Islam to terrorism, without doing much with those ideas beyond repeating them in a fairly predictable way. One review specifically described the episode as disappointing, not because it was offensive, but because it felt lazy, relying on stereotypes the writer felt had already been used many times before, rather than finding a genuinely new angle on the subject. Other viewers pushed back on this reading entirely, arguing that the episode's willingness to mock religious extremism sat in line with the show's history of treating every religion and culture with the same blunt, indiscriminate style of humor, pointing to earlier episodes mocking other cultures and nationalities as evidence the show was not singling out Islam specifically. None of that initial reaction, whether positive or negative, is what ultimately defined this episode's legacy. What changed everything happened almost exactly 1 month after the episode's original broadcast, when the Boston Marathon bombing took place on April 15th, 2013. The real-world attack, which killed several people and injured hundreds more during one of the most well-known annual marathon events in the country, created an association between the episode's own fictional terrorist storyline and an actual tragedy that had just taken place in the same general window of time. The connection went beyond simple timing. The episode itself contains a cutaway gag, a short, unrelated joke the show frequently uses to break away from its main plot, that depicts Peter driving a car through runners at the Boston Marathon. This cutaway had nothing directly to do with the episode's terrorist storyline involving Mahmoud and the bridge, functioning as its own separate joke entirely unrelated to religion or terrorism. Once the real bombing took place at that same event only weeks later, the combination of that specific cutaway gag, alongside the episode's broader plot involving a Muslim character turned terrorist, created a set of coincidences that made the entire episode feel deeply uncomfortable to revisit. Fox responded by pulling the episode from syndication and, later, from streaming platforms, keeping it out of circulation for years following the Boston bombing. This kind of removal is rare for Family Guy, a show that generally keeps its entire back catalog available to audiences regardless of how controversial or dated individual episodes might seem over time. The decision here was not driven by complaints about the writing or a formal campaign from an advocacy group, the way some other controversial episodes have been handled. It was driven almost entirely by unfortunate timing, a fictional storyline about a bombing plot combined with an unrelated joke depicting violence at the exact real-world event that would soon become the site of an actual attack. This makes the episode's controversy fundamentally different from most others connected to the show. Nearly every other entry on any list of Family Guy's most controversial episodes involves backlash generated by the content itself. Jokes that upset people specifically purely because of what was written and produced. This episode became difficult to watch, not because of anything the writers could have predicted, but because real events overtook the fictional story only weeks after it aired, turning an ordinary, if somewhat cliched, terrorist plot storyline into something that felt uncomfortably close to a tragedy nobody involved in making the episode could have seen coming. The episode's eventual return to circulation came only after enough time had passed that the immediate association with the Boston bombing had faded from public memory, allowing Fox to bring it back into rotation without the same discomfort that kept it pulled for years. Even now, discussion of the episode online frequently centers less on the actual content of the jokes involving Mahmoud and Islam, and more on the strange coincidence connecting its broadcast date to a real tragedy that unfolded not long after, a detail that has become inseparable from how the episode gets remembered and discussed. That distinction between controversy created by writers making a deliberate choice and controversy created by real-world events colliding with a finished piece of fiction after the fact sets this entry apart from nearly everything else connected to the show's history.
It also raises a broader question about how any piece of entertainment handles subjects like terrorism and violence. Given that no writer can fully predict what might happen in the real world during the weeks or months following a broadcast, and how much responsibility a network should take for material that only becomes uncomfortable in hindsight rather than at the moment it was written. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same tension between material that was written as straightforward satire and material that ends up read very differently once placed next to something far more universally sensitive carries directly into another entry on this list, one involving a portrayal of a figure recognized across nearly every culture and religion in the world, and a storyline that pushed that portrayal into territory few other shows would have attempted at all.
Section 7. The 2,000-Year-Old Virgin, a Christmas special built around Jesus. Family Guy has poked at Christianity more than almost any other subject across its entire run, treating church, scripture, and religious tradition the same way it treats every other target, as material worth mining for a joke, rather than something to leave untouched. Most of that material shows up in quick side jokes or brief cutaways that come and go within seconds. One holiday episode from the show's 13th season went much further than that, building an entire half-hour Christmas special around a fully developed storyline featuring Jesus as a main character, one who spends the episode lying to his friends, chasing after a married woman, and eventually getting caught in his own scheme. That episode is called The 2,000-Year-Old Virgin, and it stands as one of the most direct religious storylines the show has ever attempted. The episode aired on Fox on December 7th, 2014, as the 6th episode of the show's 13th season and the 237th episode of the series overall. It was written by Ted Jessup and directed by Joseph Lee, and it arrived as one of the show's yearly Christmas specials, a tradition Family Guy had leaned into many times before, with episodes built around the holiday season. The title itself is a direct play on two earlier pieces of comedy, borrowing its structure from the well-known film about a middle-aged man who has never had sex, and its wording from a classic comedy routine built around a character claiming to be thousands of years old. Putting those two ideas together and attaching them to Jesus gave the writers their central premise before a single scene was written. The story begins with Peter and Lois running into Jesus during a trip to the Quahog Mall while doing their Christmas shopping. This encounter reveals that Jesus has continued living quietly around Quahog, choosing to stay in the area rather than return home, largely because he does not feel entirely comfortable dealing with his relationship with God, portrayed in the show as his father in a strained and awkward family dynamic, rather than anything traditionally reverent. Jesus invites Peter back to his place, but once Peter sees just how depressing and empty Jesus' small bachelor apartment actually is, he decides to take him out instead, bringing him along to the Drunken Clam to spend time with Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe. While hanging out at the bar, the group starts planning a birthday celebration for Jesus, tying the moment to the fact that his birthday falls around the same time as the holiday itself. During this planning, Jesus admits to the group that he has never had sex in his entire existence, a revelation the writers use to set the entire plot in motion. Wanting to make his birthday memorable, Peter and the rest of the group decide they are going to help Jesus lose his virginity before the celebration is over, treating the mission with the same chaotic enthusiasm the group usually brings to any ridiculous scheme on the show. Their first attempt to help Jesus involves taking him to a speed dating event, hoping the format will let him quickly meet someone interested in spending the night with him. This attempt fails completely, leaving Peter frustrated that their plan has not worked as easily as he expected. Lois then steps in, trying to figure out on her own what kind of woman might actually interest Jesus, attempting to help from a more thoughtful angle, rather than relying on the group's usual chaotic approach. The problem is that Lois's genuine kindness while trying to help ends up having an unexpected unexpected effect, causing Jesus to become interested in sleeping with her specifically, rather than with any of the women the group had been trying to set him up with. Jesus approaches Peter directly about this, and Peter reacts with visible shock at the idea of Jesus wanting to sleep with his wife. Despite his initial reaction, Peter ends up agreeing to help make it happen once Jesus offers him an expensive massage chair as payment in exchange for access to Lois. Peter goes along with the arrangement, telling Lois about Jesus' interest in her, and Lois, though clearly reluctant about the entire situation, ultimately agrees to go along with it as well. This entire sequence forms the emotional core of the episode's back half, turning what started as a well-meaning effort to help a friend into a plot involving a husband essentially trading his wife's time for a piece of furniture. As Lois and Jesus head off together to a hotel, Peter stays behind at the bar, initially enjoying his new massage chair without much concern. That calm does not last. Peter begins imagining what is happening between Lois and Jesus at the hotel, and the mental image is enough to make him deeply uncomfortable, causing him to start having serious second thoughts about the entire arrangement he agreed to only a short time earlier. While Peter is spiraling over what he has allowed to happen, other people at the bar reveal something important that changes the entire understanding of Jesus' supposed virginity. According to them, Jesus is not actually a virgin at all. Instead, this is described as an annual routine he repeats every single Christmas, using the promise of gifts to convince married men to hand over access to their wives, all under the pretense of needing help losing his virginity for the very first time. This revelation sends Peter rushing to the hotel in a panic, desperate to stop whatever might be happening between Jesus and Lois before it goes any further. When he arrives, he discovers that nothing actually happened between them. Lois made the decision on her own not to go through with anything, having concluded that her marriage to Peter meant too much to risk over the entire arrangement, regardless of what Peter himself had already agreed to earlier in the episode. Jesus, confronted with the fact that his scheme did not work this time, reacts by praising Peter and Lois for what he frames as learning an important lesson, nervously claiming afterward that the entire elaborate setup had actually been a test meant to demonstrate the value of resisting temptation, before quickly leaving the scene rather than face any further questions about his real motives. The episode closes with an entirely separate holiday storyline involving Stewie and his toy companion Rupert, following a much smaller and gentler plot about a Christmas gift misunderstanding that has nothing to do with the Jesus storyline running through the rest of the episode. This closing sequence gives the episode a softer, quieter ending after the far more chaotic and religiously charged plot that occupies most of its runtime. A structure the show has used many times before, pairing one loud, controversial storyline with a smaller, more sentimental one to close out an episode. When the episode aired, it drew a strong audience for its time slot, pulling in 4.44 million viewers and landing as the second most watched program on Fox that night, trailing only behind that week's Simpsons Christmas episode airing in the same block. That kind of viewership placed the episode solidly within the range Family Guy typically drew during this period of its run, showing that whatever controversy the episode's premise might generate did not appear to hurt its ability to draw a large holiday audience. The show's own team seems to anticipate that the episode's subject matter would upset some viewers well before it ever aired. Steve Callahan, one of the show's executive producers, addressed this directly in an interview given ahead of the start of the season, telling Entertainment Weekly that the writers had built a joke into the episode, specifically acknowledging that they expected some portion of the audience to be irritated by what they were about to see. This kind of advance acknowledgement is relatively rare for the show, which usually lets its most controversial material speak for itself rather than commenting on the expected reaction before an episode even reaches air. That kind of self-awareness shows up directly inside the episode itself as well, with Peter delivering a line partway through acknowledging the idea of offended viewers writing complaints to a fictional watchdog group clearly modeled after real advocacy organizations that have criticized the show many times over the years. This kind of joke, where the show pokes fun at its own history of generating complaints while simultaneously delivering the exact kind of content likely to generate more of them, is a technique Family Guy has used across many of its most controversial episodes, treating the predictable backlash almost as part of the entertainment itself rather than something to avoid. Reaction to the episode once it aired followed a familiar pattern for anything involving this level of direct religious content. Some commentary treated the episode as part of a long-running trend of shows and public figures mocking Christian symbols and figures more freely than they might approach other religions, with one piece of commentary specifically framing the episode as evidence of an uneven standard, arguing that a similar storyline built around a different religion's central figure would likely never make it to air on a major network the way this one did. This argument, that Christianity gets treated as a safer target target for mockery compared to other major world religions is one that comes up repeatedly whenever the show tackles Christian subject matter directly, and it surfaced again here almost immediately after the episode aired. Other reviewers focused less on any broader argument about religious double standards, and more on how the episode handled its central joke as a piece of comedy writing. Some described the episode as entertaining and well-timed for the holiday season, noting that the writers seemed to be deliberately stirring up trouble with certain religious audiences as part of the fun, rather than as an afterthought, treating the entire premise as a knowing, self-aware kind of provocation, rather than something written carelessly. This split between viewers offended by the core premise itself and viewers who saw the entire episode as clearly intentional provocation aimed at generating exactly this kind of reaction mirrors the same divide that shows up across almost every religiously themed episode the show has ever produced. What makes this episode stand out within Family Guy's larger history of religious material is how far it goes in giving Jesus an actual personality and storyline, rather than using him for a single quick joke and moving on. Most of the show's religious humor involves brief appearances, quick visual gags, or short lines mocking a concept in passing. This episode instead builds Jesus into something closer to a fully developed guest character, giving him his own motivations, his own long-running scheme, and his own arc that gets resolved by the end of the episode. That level of investment in a religious figure as an actual character, rather than a passing target for a joke, is part of what separates this episode from most of the show's other Christianity-related content. The episode also stands apart because of how directly it ties its central joke to marriage and fidelity, rather than keeping the religious material as its own separate, self-contained target. By building the entire plot around Peter agreeing to let another man, even a religious figure treated with obvious irreverence throughout, potentially sleep with his wife in exchange for a piece of furniture, the writers layered a joke about marriage and personal values directly on top of the religious material, giving critics multiple separate angles to react to rather than a single clean target. Some criticism focused purely on the religious content, some focused on how casually the episode treated the idea of a husband agreeing to something like this in the first place, and some focused on how the episode ultimately resolved the plot by having Lois make the moral choice on her own, rather than having Peter's agreement carry any real consequence. That resolution itself became a small point of discussion in its own right, since the episode ultimately steers away from actually depicting any infidelity, letting Lois pull back from the situation before anything happens, and reframing the entire elaborate setup as something closer to a moral test than a genuine affair. This choice allowed the show to push its premise about as far as a network broadcast could reasonably go, flirting directly with infidelity and religious mockery at the same time, while still pulling back before the story crossed into territory that might have made the episode dramatically harder to defend after the fact. Taken together, the episode represents one of the clearest examples of Family Guy using religion not as a quick punchline dropped into an unrelated storyline, but as the entire foundation of a Christmas special, built specifically to generate discussion, debate, and complaints during one of the most watched weeks of the television calendar. The show's own acknowledgement ahead of time that the material would likely upset people, paired with a joke embedded directly inside the episode addressing that exact expectation, shows a level of self-awareness about its own controversial reputation that few of the other entries on this list display quite so openly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern, an episode built around content the writers clearly expected to upset a significant portion of their audience well before it ever aired, connects directly into another entry on this list, one that pushed a different kind of boundary entirely, trading religious mockery for a holiday storyline built around two of the show's own family members, and a moment many viewers found far harder to explain away as simple satire. Section 8. Halloween on Spooner Street, a holiday special with 3 uncomfortable storylines. Family Guy has produced plenty of holiday specials over the years, leaning into Christmas and Thanksgiving multiple times throughout its run. Halloween, by comparison, has only gotten this treatment once, making the show's single dedicated Halloween episode something of a rarity within its own history. Rather than playing it safe with its one shot at the holiday, the show packed the episode with 3 separate storylines running side by side, each pushing into territory that generated its own share of discomfort among viewers. That episode is called Halloween on Spooner Street, and while it never became the show's most talked about controversy, it remains one of the clearest examples of Family Guy cramming multiple uncomfortable ideas into a single half hour, rather than spreading them across separate episodes. The episode aired on Fox on November 7th, 2010, as the 4th episode of the show's 9th season and the 151st episode of the series overall. It was written by Andrew Goldberg, one of the show's longtime writers, and directed by Jerry Langford. The episode also featured a guest appearance from actor Patrick Stewart, adding a recognizable name to the voice cast for this particular installment. Despite being built specifically around Halloween, the episode actually aired about a week after the holiday itself had already passed, a small scheduling detail that drew some passing criticism from viewers who found it strange for a holiday-themed special to air after the holiday it was centered around. The episode splits its runtime across 3 distinct storylines, each following a different combination of characters through their own version of a Halloween night in Quahog. The first and most fully developed of the 3 follows Brian taking Stewie out for his very first experience trick-or-treating. This storyline plays out as a fairly grounded, almost sweet father and son style outing at first, with Brian guiding Stewie through the basics of collecting candy door to door. That calm does not last. A group of older kids, led by a bully named Justin, steals Stewie's candy during the night, and Brian himself gets sprayed with pink paint by the same group while attempting to intervene on Stewie's behalf. What follows is an escalating series of attempts by Stewie to get his candy back and settle the score with the boys responsible. Brian, normally the more level-headed and reasonable presence compared to Stewie's usual violent fantasies, ends up shocking Stewie by encouraging him to pursue actual revenge against the boys, rather than simply letting the incident go.
Stewie eventually tracks the boys down and threatens them using a rocket launcher, a typically over-the-top escalation for the show, only to end up knocked off a roof after one of the boys throws a rock at him, accidentally triggering the weapon and launching a rocket in the process. Stunned and frightened by how far things have gone, Stewie ends up crying out for his mother rather than following through with any further violence. Lois eventually gets pulled into this storyline once Stewie's ordeal reaches its conclusion, marching over to the home of the boy responsible for stealing the candy in the first place. Rather than simply recovering the stolen candy, Lois goes a step further, demanding cash from the boy's mother as an additional form of compensation for what happened to Stewie during the night. This storyline closes out on a lighter note compared to the other 2 threads running through the episode, generally receiving more favorable attention from reviewers who found it the strongest and most fully developed of the 3 plots, built around a clear beginning, middle, and end, rather than simply existing to deliver a single shocking moment. The second storyline follows Peter and Joe as they team up to pull a series of increasingly painful and humiliating pranks on Quagmire throughout the night. Quagmire, initially unaware of who is behind the escalating harassment, eventually figures out that his 2 friends are responsible and begins plotting his own form of revenge in response. This leads to a sequence where Quagmire reveals that his grandfather had served as a kamikaze pilot, information he uses to convince Peter and Joe to join him for what starts as an innocent evening flight in a collection of vintage planes he happens to have stored on his property, including a fully functional Japanese fighter plane from World War II. The storyline builds toward Quagmire using the flight itself as the setting for his own prank, putting Peter and Joe through a frightening experience while getting his revenge for everything they had put him through earlier in the episode. This storyline drew its own separate criticism, primarily centered on how it leaned into jokes connected to Japanese culture and stereotypes tied to World War II era imagery, an angle some reviewers felt crossed into uncomfortable territory on its own, separate from anything involving the episode's other 2 storylines. Combined with a scene involving Peter and Quagmire treating an incident of domestic conflict between 2 smaller statured characters as a form of entertainment rather than something to take seriously, this second storyline picked up its own share of criticism for leaning on race-based humor layered on top of everything else happening across the episode. The third storyline is the one that ended up defining the episode's reputation more than either of the other 2 combined. This plot follows Chris and his older sister Meg as they head out separately to attend a Halloween party being held at the home of Connie D'Amico, a classmate frequently featured throughout the series. Before the party even begins, the storyline opens with its own smaller controversy, showing Chris coming downstairs dressed as comedian Bill Cosby, complete with makeup meant to darken his skin to match the character. Lois immediately objects to the costume, telling Chris directly that dressing this way is racist, and insisting he change into something else before leaving the house. After Chris changes into a costume based on Haji, a character from the animated series Johnny Quest, Lois objects again, informing him that this costume carries the same issue and pushing him toward a different option entirely. This exchange functions as a piece of self-aware commentary from the show, acknowledging the exact kind of criticism the show itself frequently receives over how it handles race, delivered through Lois calling out Chris's costume choices directly, rather than the show simply presenting the costumes without comment. Once Chris and Meg both arrive separately at the Halloween party, the storyline moves into its most talked about sequence. Meg, dressed in a costume that draws attention
attention from other partygoers, ends up being chosen to take part in a game of spin the bottle during the party. The game leads her into a closet with another partygoer dressed in a full Optimus Prime costume, complete with a mask that fully conceals the wearer's identity. The two of them begin making out inside the closet, unaware of who the other person actually is, thanks to the costume hiding their identity completely. When the rest of the party eventually interrupts the moment and the closet door opens, both Meg and the person she has been kissing discover that the other person is Chris, her own brother, who had been wearing the Optimus Prime costume the entire time without either of them realizing who they were with. The show plays the immediate aftermath of this reveal as one of shock and disgust from both characters, with Meg and Chris both reacting with visible horror once they understand what has just happened between them. Despite this reaction in the moment, the storyline does not end there. Rather than simply treating the incident as an isolated, horrifying mistake immediately buried and forgotten, the episode shows both siblings continuing to interact with each other afterward, in a way some viewers and critics interpreted as suggesting the two of them chose to keep some version of the relationship going, rather than treating the incident purely as an accident to move past entirely. In the episode's closing scene, both Chris and Meg tell their family that they each managed to hook up with someone at the party, without revealing to anyone else in the household that the person they had actually been with was each other. This storyline generated the most direct and lasting criticism connected to the episode, with reviewers and viewers alike describing the plotline as uncomfortable, regardless of how self-aware the show tried to be about the situation. Some criticism focused specifically on the show choosing to have the characters acknowledge how disgusting the situation was, rather than simply avoiding the premise altogether, arguing that acknowledging the discomfort within the show itself did not make the underlying joke any funnier or easier to sit through. Other critics focused more narrowly on the choice to include any hint that the relationship between the two siblings might continue beyond the initial encounter, treating that detail as crossing further into territory that felt unnecessary, even by the show's usual standards for pushing boundaries. Compared to the episode's other two storylines, both of which drew their own separate criticism over issues involving race and stereotypes, the Chris and Meg storyline became the detail most frequently cited whenever this particular episode comes up in broader conversations about the show's most controversial material. Reviews covering the episode as a whole often singled this specific plotline out directly, describing it in blunt terms as disgusting rather than funny, while still acknowledging that the episode's other storylines, particularly the Brian and Stewie trick-or-treating plot, worked considerably better on their own. What makes this episode a genuinely unusual entry within the larger list of Family Guy's most controversial material is how it manages to generate separate criticism from three completely different angles within a single half hour, rather than concentrating all of its most uncomfortable material into one central storyline, the way most controversial episodes tend to do. A viewer offended by the show's handling of race in the Quagmire revenge plot might have an entirely different reaction than a viewer specifically bothered by the Chris and Meg storyline. And a viewer uncomfortable with both of those threads might still find the Brian and Stewie material perfectly enjoyable on its own. This episode essentially offers three separate entry points into controversy, rather than one clear target, spreading its most talked about content across storylines that otherwise have almost nothing to do with each other, beyond taking place on the same night in the same town. Being the show's only dedicated Halloween special also gives this episode a somewhat unusual place in the broader catalog of Family Guy's holiday content. Unlike the show's many Christmas and Thanksgiving specials, which offer multiple entries to compare and contrast against each other over the years, this episode stands entirely alone as the single example of how the show chose to handle this particular holiday, meaning whatever reputation it built for itself became the only reference point available for how Family Guy approaches Halloween as a subject at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same idea of packing multiple separate sources of controversy into a single storyline rather than spreading them out connects into the very different kind of situation found in the next entry on this list, one involving not three smaller storylines colliding inside one episode, but a single central relationship the show built and maintained across years of episodes, one that eventually ended in a way many longtime viewers were not prepared for at all. Section 9. Life of Brian. Killing off a main character. Family Guy has spent years pushing shock value through violent jokes, offensive punchlines, and storylines built to upset entire groups of viewers. Almost none of that material actually costs the show anything in the long run, since jokes fade and controversies move on to the next episode. One episode from the show's 12th season managed to generate a reaction unlike almost anything else in the series' history. Not through an offensive joke or a controversial stereotype, but through a single, permanent-seeming decision, killing off one of the show's 5 main characters entirely. That episode is called Life of Brian, and the fallout from it remains one of the more unusual stories in the show's long run, precisely because of how quickly the decision ended up getting reversed once the reaction set in. The episode aired on Fox on November 24th, 2013, as the 6th episode of the show's 12th season. Brian Griffin, the family's talking dog and one of the 5 characters who has appeared in the series from its very beginning, had spent well over a decade as one of the most consistent and heavily featured characters on the show, serving as a sarcastic, often world-weary voice of reason compared to Peter's usual chaos. Losing a character like Brian carried far more weight than losing almost any other figure in the Griffin family's orbit, given how central he had been to the show's overall identity since it first premiered. The episode opens with a storyline involving Stewie and a time machine he had built and used throughout earlier episodes of the show. Brian, frustrated with how Stewie has been misusing the device, ends up destroying the time machine's parts, removing Stewie's ability to travel through time for the remainder of the episode. This decision, made early in the episode almost as a side note to the main plot, becomes critically important by the time the episode reaches its final act, since it means Stewie no longer has any way to undo whatever happens next. Later in the episode, Brian is playing street hockey outside the Griffin home, an ordinary and low-stakes activity that gives no real warning of what is about to happen. During the game, Brian is struck by a passing car and severely injured. The family rushes him to the vet immediately, hoping his injuries can be treated, but the damage turns out to be too severe. Brian dies on the operating table, and the episode chooses to treat this moment with an unusually serious tone, rather than following the show's typical pattern of undercutting tragedy with a quick joke.
The Griffin family's grief, particularly from Peter and Stewie, who had one of the closest relationships with Brian throughout the series, is shown with a level of sincerity rarely seen anywhere else in the show's history. Rather than ending the episode on that note of loss, the story moves forward into how the family copes with Brian's absence. Peter and Lois eventually decide to adopt a new dog to help fill the gap Brian's death has left in the household, bringing home a tough-talking Italian greyhound named Vinny, voiced by actor Tony Sirico, known for his work playing a mob associate on a well-regarded television drama. Stewie initially resists forming any kind of bond with Vinny, still processing the loss of Brian, but gradually begins to warm up to the new dog by the end of the episode, suggesting the show intended for Vinny to become a lasting replacement moving forward, rather than a brief, temporary character. That intention became clear almost immediately once the following week's episode aired. Rather than treating Brian's death and Vinny's arrival as something the show would slowly ease audiences into, the very next episode had already fully accepted this new status quo, showing Vinny casually spending time with the family as though he had always been part of the household. This speed, moving from Brian's death directly into full acceptance of his replacement within a single week, became one of the most criticized aspects of how the show initially handled the entire situation, with many longtime viewers feeling the show was rushing past the loss of a major character far too quickly for the moment to feel earned. Fan reaction to Brian's death arrived quickly, and with an intensity that appeared to catch even the show's own creative team off guard. Seth MacFarlane, who created the series and also provides Brian's voice, later spoke about how surprised the writing staff was by the scale of the response, describing the anger from fans as something the team had not fully anticipated going into the episode. According to MacFarlane, the team expected the decision to generate some level of discussion and pushback, but the sheer intensity of the backlash went well beyond what anyone involved with the show had prepared for. That backlash showed up across social media almost immediately, with fans expressing genuine grief and frustration over losing a character who had been part of the show since its very first episode. A petition calling for Brian to be brought back into the series quickly gathered more than 100,000 signatures, giving the production team a clear, measurable sign of just how strongly a significant portion of the audience felt about reversing the decision. Beyond the petition itself, many fans made public threats to stop watching the show entirely if Brian's death was allowed to remain permanent, treating the loss of the character as a serious enough issue to consider abandoning a series some had followed for well over a decade. Faced with this level of sustained pressure, the show's creative team made the decision to bring Brian back only a short time after his death first aired. Rather than letting the character's absence play out across an extended stretch of episodes, Family Guy reversed course just 3 episodes later, restoring Brian during the season's Christmas episode, titled Christmas Guy, which aired on December 15th, 2013, less than a month after Life of Brian had first introduced his death to audiences. The explanation the show gave for Brian's return leaned on the same kind of time travel mechanics the earlier episode had specifically taken away from Stewie.
In Christmas Guy, Stewie is shown still grieving deeply over the loss of his closest companion, and during a trip to a mall with Vinny, he happens to encounter a version of himself from before the events of Life of Brian, complete with access to a functioning time machine that had not yet been destroyed within that earlier point in the show's own timeline. Stewie takes advantage of this opportunity, using the earlier version's time travel device to go back and physically prevent the car accident that killed Brian in the first place, effectively erasing the entire chain of events that led to his death and to Vinny's adoption in the process. This resolution allowed the show to restore its original 5-character core group without technically walking back the events of Life of Brian as they had originally aired, since the timeline itself was rewritten from within the show's own fictional logic, rather than simply ignoring what had happened.
Once Christmas Guy aired, the show moved forward largely as though Brian's death and replacement had never taken place at all, with Vinny appearing only in a handful of minor moments afterward, before mostly disappearing from the show's ongoing storylines going forward. McFarlane addressed the reversal publicly around the time Christmas Guy aired, posting a message thanking fans for how much they clearly cared about Brian's character, while also acknowledging in a lighthearted way that the show had never actually intended to keep the character dead for good. This kind of direct public acknowledgement that the entire arc had been built around generating a strong emotional reaction, only to reverse the outcome once that reaction had been achieved, added its own layer to how fans and critics discussed the episode afterward. Reaction to Brian's eventual return ended up just as divided as the reaction to his original death had been.
Some fans felt genuine relief and satisfaction at seeing the character restored, treating the show's decision to listen to such an overwhelming response as a positive example of a production team paying attention to what its audience actually wanted. Other fans took a very different view, arguing that reversing Brian's death within only a few episodes cheapened the entire storyline from start to finish, suggesting that any emotional weight the original death carried had been undone the moment the show revealed the whole arc could simply be erased through a convenient piece of time travel logic already established elsewhere in the series.
This second group of critics often pointed to how other long-running shows have handled the death of a major character in the past, drawing comparisons to series that had killed off characters in ways meant to stick permanently, arguing that Family Guy's quick reversal made the entire arc feel more like a temporary stunt built to generate short-term buzz and reaction, rather than a genuine, lasting creative choice. Some fans specifically argued that the character should have simply remained dead once the show had gone through with the decision in the first place, feeling that reversing course sent an unintended message that even the show's own writers did not take the earlier storyline seriously enough to commit to its consequences. What makes this entry different from most of the other controversies connected to Family Guy is the type of reaction it generated in the first place.
Nearly every other entry on this list involves an audience upset by something the show chose to include, a joke, a stereotype, or a storyline touching on a sensitive real-world subject. This controversy worked in the opposite direction entirely, built around audiences upset by something the show chose to take away, specifically the permanent presence of a character many viewers had spent over a decade watching grow and develop across hundreds of episodes. Rather than reacting to a joke that went too far, fans were reacting to the sudden absence of something they had come to expect and rely on every week the show aired a new episode. The scale of the emotional investment surrounding an animated character surprised even people closely connected to the show's production, highlighting just how deeply audiences had connected with Brian specifically, despite him technically being a talking dog inside an animated comedy built around constant absurdity and exaggeration.
That level of attachment offers a different kind of insight into what actually keeps an audience engaged with a long-running series, showing that even a show built almost entirely around irreverent, over-the-top humor can still generate a deeply sincere emotional reaction once it touches something audiences have quietly grown attached to over many years of consistent viewing. The entire arc, running from Brian's death in Life of Brian through his return in Christmas Guy only a few weeks later, remains a rare example within the show's history of the audience itself directly influencing a major creative decision in close to real time, rather than years of accumulated criticism slowly shaping how the show approaches a particular subject going forward. Few other moments in the show's run demonstrate quite as clearly just how quickly a production team can reverse course when the reaction from its audience becomes large and immediate enough to demand it.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
That same idea of a storyline built around real consequences that end up getting reversed once the reaction proves too strong to ignore stands in direct contrast to the final entry on this list, one involving a real historical horror the show chose to fold directly into one of its
recurring comedic storylines, raising a very different kind of question about where the show's usual willingness to joke about anything finally meets a subject too heavy to handle the same way. Section 10. Road to Germany. Time travel into the Holocaust. Family Guy has used time travel as a plot device many times throughout its run, sending characters like Brian and Stewie into different eras for a mix of comedy and adventure. Most of these trips land somewhere safely absurd, giving the writers room for historical jokes without ever touching anything too heavy.
One episode from the show's 7th season broke from that pattern entirely, sending its 2 lead time travelers directly into the first day of World War II, dragging a Jewish supporting character along for a story that mixed the show's usual chaotic humor with a setting connected to one of the darkest events in modern history. That episode is called Road to Germany, and it remains one of the more debated entries in the show's history precisely because of how directly it places comedy next to the beginning of the Holocaust. The episode aired on Fox on October 26, 2008, as the 3rd episode of the show's 7th season and the 113th episode of the series overall. It was written by Patrick Meighan, who had also written earlier entries in the show's long-running series of Road to episodes, a recurring format built around Brian and Stewie traveling somewhere together and getting into trouble along the way. The episode was directed by Greg Colton, a series regular behind the camera, and featured guest voice work from several performers, including Brian Blessed and Gregory Jabara. The story opens with a fairly typical Family Guy setup. The Griffins and their neighbors are gathered together watching the Academy Awards, a ceremony the episode presents with its own exaggerated, fictional hosts for comic effect. During the broadcast, Mort Goldman, a recurring Jewish character who runs the local pharmacy and appears throughout the series, finds himself in urgent need of a bathroom. With the main bathroom already occupied by Meg, Mort rushes upstairs and ends up in Stewie's room, where he mistakes a strange-looking device for a portable toilet and climbs inside. That device turns out to be Stewie's time machine, a piece of technology Stewie had built earlier in the show's run after growing bored with a simple children's toy. The moment Mort steps inside, he is instantly transported out of the present day entirely. Brian and Stewie soon realize what has happened and decide they need to go after Mort to bring him back safely. Using the same time machine, the two of them travel to the exact time and place Mort was sent to, arriving in Warsaw, Poland on September 1st, 1939. That specific date is not chosen at random within the story. It marks the day Nazi Germany launched its invasion of Poland, the event widely recognized as the official start of World War II in Europe. To make the coincidence even sharper, Brian and Stewie discover that Mort has landed in the middle of his own paternal grandparents' wedding, a joyful family celebration taking place on the very same day that history would come to remember as the beginning of one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century. The episode plays this contrast directly, opening its time travel sequence with a warm, festive Jewish wedding scene, before shifting hard into the arrival of invading forces, a transition several critics later singled out as unusually effective for a show generally more interested in jokes than atmosphere. Brian and Stewie now have to track down Mort within this chaotic setting and figure out a way to get all 3 of them back to the present day safely, all while Nazi forces are actively moving through the area around them. Complicating their escape further, the group discovers that the time machine's return function requires a specific fuel source to work, and the version of the device they are using has run out of what it needs to send them home. This forces Brian, Stewie, and Mort to travel onward to find more of the material required to power their return trip, pulling them deeper into a story that has them moving through Nazi-occupied territory while actively being pursued along the way. Their search eventually takes them to England, continuing a storyline that blends real historical setting with the show's usual exaggerated, over-the-top style of comedy, including a sequence where Stewie disguises himself as Adolf Hitler in order to move through hostile territory without being caught. The trio eventually manages to gather what they need and returns to the present day successfully, arriving back in Stewie's room just moments before the original version of Mort, still in the present timeline, stumbles into the time machine for the very first time. To prevent the entire sequence of events from repeating itself, and to keep Mort from ever learning that he had briefly traveled through time at all, Stewie makes the decision to kill the version of Mort who had just returned with them, shoving him into the machine and destroying it entirely with a weapon he has on hand. The original, unaware version of Mort then enters the room moments later, finding no time machine waiting for him, and the episode closes on him suffering an embarrassing accident as a direct result of no longer having anywhere to relieve himself. Reaction to the episode when it aired was largely positive, with the broadcast drawing an audience of roughly 9 million viewers, a strong number for the show at that point in its run. Critics generally responded well to the episode, praising the balance the writers struck between the show's
usual irreverent style of humor and a genuinely tense, dramatic setting built around one of history's most serious subjects.
Some later commentary specifically highlighted the episode's opening moment set at the wedding, describing the shift from celebration to the arrival of invading forces as one of the more emotionally effective sequences the show has ever produced, distinct from its usual approach of moving quickly from one joke to the next without lingering on any single moment for very long. Not every reaction to the episode was purely positive. Some viewers pushed back specifically on the choice to build an entire storyline around the start of World War II and, by extension, the beginning of the Holocaust, using the Jewish character of Mort as the anchor connecting the fictional plot to a real, deeply painful chapter of history. Critics raising this concern argued that, even with careful writing, using the outbreak of the Holocaust as a backdrop for a comedic time travel adventure risked treating an event responsible for the deaths of millions of people as simply another setting for jokes, no different in the show's eyes from any other historical period Brian and Stewie might visit for a laugh. This criticism connects to a pattern that shows up across several entries on this list. The tension between treating every subject with the exact same comedic tools, regardless of how serious it is in real life, and recognizing that certain historical events carry a weight that resists being folded neatly into a half-hour comedy format, no matter how skillfully the writing handles the transition.
Family Guy has built its entire identity around refusing to treat any subject as fully off-limits, and this episode represents one of the clearest tests of that philosophy, taking one of the most universally recognized atrocities in modern history and using it as the setting for a story that still needs to deliver laughs by the time the credits roll. What separates this episode from more straightforward controversies elsewhere on this list is how much of the reaction actually leaned favorable rather than critical. Unlike episodes built around jokes that clearly upset large portions of the audience from the moment they aired, Road to Germany earned praise from many of the same critics who have been quick to criticize the show's handling of sensitive material in other episodes, specifically because of how it balanced its comedic elements with moments of genuine gravity rather than undermining the seriousness of its setting entirely.
The episode's willingness to let a scene simply sit in its own sadness without immediately cutting away to a joke stands out as unusual within a series otherwise defined by constant, rapid-fire humor. At the same time, the small but consistent thread of criticism aimed at the episode's core premise raises a question that runs through the entire history of Family Guy's most talked about episodes. A show built specifically around treating every subject with equal irreverence will inevitably run into material serious enough that even careful, well-regarded writing cannot fully satisfy everyone watching. Road to Germany manages to walk that line about as well as the show ever has, earning strong reviews and a large audience, while still leaving a portion of viewers uneasy about using the start of the Holocaust as the setting for an adventure built around a talking dog, an infant genius, and a pharmacist accidentally caught in the middle of history.
Looking across all 10 of these episodes together, a clear pattern emerges about what actually generates lasting controversy for a show built entirely around pushing boundaries. Some episodes, like the one built around abortion, generated controversy purely through network decisions made before broadcast ever happened. Others, like the crossover joke referencing sexual assault or the storyline involving a real politician's family, drew criticism because a single specific line landed directly on real people or real subjects still actively being discussed in the news at the time. Still others, like the episode Killing Off Brian, generated backlash not because of anything offensive at all, but because of how deeply an audience had come to care about a character over years of consistent viewing. Road to Germany closes out this list by showing a different possibility entirely, an episode built around genuinely difficult subject matter that still managed to earn praise from critics and audiences alike, proving that even Family Guy's most serious detours can land well when the writing takes the moment as seriously as the history demands. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.